Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. I'm Hannah Steiman. I'm president of Peak Support. I'll introduce myself and then turn it over to Tony for an introduction as well. So Peak Support is a customer service outsourcing firm, and gaming is one of our verticals. We have about 2,000 people in Philippines, Colombia, Eastern Europe, the US, a little bit in India for tech roles, and Egypt on the horizon for a lower cost option for serving EU languages. We've been in business since 2015, and people are our business. People, culture, recruiting, all of the things we're going to be talking about today. This is our business. We accept only 1 in 50 applicants. That's because of our culture, because of our reputation. We have the best Glassdoor rating in the industry. So we're spending every day thinking about how to get the best people on our client teams and then how to manage them in a way that makes them deliver the best results. So really excited to be here today for this conversation with Tony. Tony, welcome.
Hello, my name's Tony Wan. I am running a consultancy called Player Support. You can think of me as a magical janitor who helps you clean things up. And so, help people on both sides of the equation, so to speak, both in terms of, BPO partners like Peak Support and video game companies directly. I've worked with a bunch of video game companies at all of the different stages of maturity, everything from startups to, really large global teams like Epic Games, Riot Games, etc. So really happy to be here and to have this conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I'll give you all a preview of, oh, this was working before. Okay, preview of what we're going to talk about today. Introductions already done. We're going to talk first at a high level about the challenges of building a high performance player support team, especially in the context of growth and scale. And then we're going to do a deep dive into some of the big challenges, recruiting and hiring, culture and management, and also getting the tech stack right. We'll have a little bit of a conversation about AI as well. So Tony, let's start here. Let's talk about what are the challenges of building a high performance scalable player support team.
Sure, yeah, there's quite a bit, but I would say the genesis of a lot of the challenges really come from how these teams are started. There is usually a lack of strategy for many video game companies. It's more along the lines of let's just try to build the most fun game possible and ship it. And then, you sort of if you have a hit, you run into some trouble immediately, like, oh, yeah, we need people to do, support and customer service because now you're getting, all of these tickets and all of these emails, and there's just way too much to deal with. And so out of the madness comes the requirement for our teams. And unfortunately, a lot of them are still sort of born this way. And there's not an amazing, or let's say a more considered uh, uh, level of thought around them. And we see this challenge too, not just for player support, but I would say across company functions. A lot of video game companies start off as just a dev team trying to make a really fun game, and
Yeah.
so that creates a lot of challenges come out of that. It could be something like getting caught into if there's a lack of knowledge on the leadership team and that continues in the life of the company, you could be mistaken for, just a cost center, or people just don't have knowledge and so they don't know what to do with it. They don't know what the potential of a support team could be. And that can perpetuate to be an unfortunate situation for folks who might get themselves caught on the operational hamster wheel and unable to uh, think about the higher level functions and value that support provides.
Yeah, I think that probably resonates with anyone who's worked for a high growth company in gaming or outside of it. But I think especially for the support team, because it's often seen as non-core, it's seen as a cost center, like you said. So it's just not where there's any focus given in the beginning. But if you're an e-commerce company, you're focused on your product, you're focused on creating a great pair of pants. You're not thinking customer support is often that afterthought. Um, so talk about the pain points. What are the specific pain points that you typically see with organizations who have built their support teams in this way?
So, there's quite a bit. So the ones we'd like to focus on today really are, recruiting is, certainly one of them. I mean, for us, a lot of times, since it is an afterthought, and many times, video game growth can be, viral, whatever word you want to use, but, you're scaling all of a sudden really, really quickly. You're going from maybe a few thousand players to millions of players in a short amount of time, and you're just overwhelmed. And so getting the right people, everything from internal staff to if you're going to outsource, if that is your strategy, finding the right partners, all of that becomes very, very difficult. And a lot of times when I talk to, former partners on the outsourcing side, that can be a huge challenge, just kind of blitz scaling together to meet demand. And so, doing that, how do you do that? How do you do it as well as you can manage considering the circumstances? And then after the fire is over, how do we recover and what's what's the sustainable long-term philosophy for how we do that, right? And so you have all these questions that come up and as anyone who's ever built a business knows, recruiting is super duper important, very difficult to do well, and as you scale, increasingly difficult, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then you've got a
Um,
team.
yeah, yeah. And then
What do
you've
you
got
do
a
with them?
team. Exactly. You can't just have a bunch of people making up their own rules and kind of, doing as each one sees fit. And management is that that kind of eternal challenge that all of our organizations are going to face. Good governance, good management, really becomes an immediate issue. A lot of times when we've had to blitz scale in the past, there's a lot of, we call them battlefield promotions, where people just kind of get thrust into it. And, that's a real kind of test for how your organization thinks about succession planning and how it thinks about, promotion and the
Yeah.
management role. But we found that, from the video game client point of view, the management roles for agents to be super duper important. But we found that that function to be in many cases in need of let's say, a little bit more of a deeper look and more regular attention, um, because a lot of it can be quite fuzzy. And we think it's not people are smart enough to figure it out. It's just that we have a lot of management principles that I would say make it extremely challenging to get a sense of performance management, accountability, finding that balance between those functions and how do we support the agents, to do their job more effectively or more efficiently, and how do we help them with what they need for continuing education, et cetera. And so you have
Yeah.
these two sides that do need a balance, and each
Yeah, it's
manager
easy
is
to
going
build
to
your
be different.
management in a haphazard way as well. Just, hey, Tony, you're a team leader now. Go figure it out.
Yeah, and then things are so busy, you just leave
Right.
them to do it, and there's not enough mentoring, et cetera, and it just
Yeah.
becomes very challenging, and the meetings drop off because everyone's busy, and
Yeah.
that's bad.
Yeah. Canceling your one-on-ones.
Yep.
And technology, getting the tech stack
Ye-
right.
Yeah, so due to the haphazard nature of how a lot of these teams get started, usually the tooling is pretty bad. Many times it's a repurposed or not even repurposed, it's just straight up the actual developer's tool that the dev team used to build the game or to make certain changes to the game, and that's very dangerous for a number of reasons. And so there's a lot of challenges to that, and you know, people maybe they purchased off-the-shelf ticketing system or a help desk that they're using, but no one really knows how to optimize it, how to use it, how to customize it, or anything like that. And there's all these kind of fragmented pieces or different tools sitting around. And, the devs are very, very busy with now trying to fix bugs, add new features to the game, etc. And so you have real challenges around prioritization, just bandwidth for people, organization, and it can be very, very challenging to try to get anything, um, you know, prioritized for support. It's always very easy to say, oh, sorry, we have to keep pushing that back. And before you know it, it's a year later and that thing you asked
Yeah,
for is still not done, right?
yeah, yeah. So let's do a deep dive into recruiting first.
Mhm.
Um, Talk about your hiring criteria. What are the top things that you're looking for in player support agents and leaders?
Sure. I think resilience is really key. It's it's a lot more important, um, I think, than some places really think about. The challenge, the challenge here is it's a tough job emotionally. People aren't pinging us to say, "Hey, hope you're having a great day," and hope everything's good with you, and thank you for the game. No, no, that's not the
Right,
nature
right,
of the issues.
right.
And they're often very passionate. They're fans. It's different than kind of complaining about maybe a vacuum cleaner or
Hmm.
something that's not quite working right and it's inconvenient. But it's not like you've invested X amount of years of your life into building up this virtual character, or it's like a way that you use to connect to your friends socially. A lot of games do have weekly events, and people are counting on you to be there,
Yeah,
within the game, etc. And so there's a lot of passion in that, and
yeah. It's your
thing,
community.
yeah, it's your community, and things can get really, really heated, and so it's just a challenging environment. We're looking for people who've been through challenges in their own life and have um, figured out their own ways to deal with hardship, to process, negative emotion,
Manage
etc. So yeah,
stress.
yep,
Yeah,
absolutely. Critical thinking is another really big one. Um, it's it's one of the challenges we find. There's a there's a way of thinking in our industry where a lot of people sort of demand strict processes and something that you can kind of just follow A through Z, and you don't really have to do much thinking. But in a lot of cases, we have much more complex situations. And, if we think about the way automations have affected, general problem complexity and support overall across industries, it's only natural it's going to continue to go that way. And so we really are looking for people who can look at something because you might have something that is a symptom similar to if you go to a doctor and you tell them you have a fever. It can be many different things. And so we really need people who are curious, who can think critically, who are going to be able to ask good questions, navigate, and really find what the issues are because issues can be multi-layered.
yeah,
There can be intersecting issues, right? And so if you diagnose too early, you could
yeah,
you could have the wrong solution, right? And so
yeah.
that's really important for us.
You can't jump to conclusions, jump to assumptions about what's going on.
Yeah, exactly. Um, Yeah, the emotional intelligence part as well. Really thinking about, again, it's the situation of the player. Sometimes it's not a straightforward technical issue, or sometimes it might have some technical elements, but you're really also have to think about what the player is experiencing emotionally at that point in time. Um, Sometimes I've seen agents sort of plow through a problem without really taking a moment to connect with the player's situation, and that can you might you might end up going to a resolution and solving the problem, but still having quite a dissatisfied or upset player on your hands. And sometimes there's literally nothing we can do from a technical perspective. They might be writing in about a ban appeal or something that they
Mhm.
disagree with. And it's not something that you can quote unquote solve or have a clear cut resolution for. There's a conversation that needs to be had, and you need to help them through it. And it's much more
Yeah,
about positioning, right?
I think the point you made about how emotional it is, it's different than a pair of pants. It is it's your community, it's your social life. I think we see this, we also serve social media companies, and you see this as well. It could be a simple login issue, but you can't log in to your social media account, which is where you're
Yeah,
interacting a lot of people. It's a big part of your life.
yeah, for
So
sure.
gaming affinity, and this is an interesting one because I think a lot of people do assume that folks have to be gamers, and you actually had a slightly different take on this.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we spent time sort of testing that hypothesis. I think it really came from, a good place, and we agree with some of it in general, but I would say just because somebody is a gamer doesn't necessarily mean they'll be good at support. We have all kinds of, folks who participate in games, but I would focus more on you at least have to care about uh, what games mean to these people. You can't hate games, right? You can't think it's a waste of time. You can't look down on people who play, a lot of games. So you have to be at least, sympathetic to what they're going through. But I mean, you could play like board games, you could play casual games, you could have been a gamer in the past, but you just don't have
Yeah.
enough time to keep playing, because you want to do other things, and that's okay. A lot of folks that have been great agents, maybe they don't play much anymore, but they have played a lot in the past. They understand what it means. They understand some of the general problems that come in because they've had them themselves. And yeah, they're just people who are amazingly bright and competent at what they do, and they genuinely care about helping people. They get satisfaction out of it, and that's good. We've had a lot of high performing agents who aren't necessarily hardcore gamers or
Right,
play the
right.
specific game that we're supporting all the time.
Yeah, yeah. And they do need to have some technical affinity as well.
Yeah, I mean, the most successful agents typically do, you can't be like completely lost around technology. It makes it quite hard because the learning curve gets a lot steeper if you've never had to troubleshoot your internet before, or you've never, dealt with the blue screen of death on your PC, or, anything like that. So at least being familiar with basic troubleshooting,
Yeah.
internet technical terms is going to help you be quicker to learn the job and to not be so afraid of it. I mean, you can train all of these things, but that is quite a steep learning curve if you're not a very technical person or it sort of scares you.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because we don't always think about player support as being technical support, but a lot of these issues are actually technical in nature. So having that affinity, even if it's just you're the go-to person in your household, when your mom's
Right.
got an issue with her cell phone,
Correct.
really does help. So we got a question in the Q&A, which was how you screen for resilience, which I think is a really good question, and that's what we're going into next. We'll also have Q&A, time for Q&A at the end, if there's additional questions. But a big part of this is a role playing exercise. So talk about how you do these role playing exercises, what you're looking for, um, practical tips for how folks can run these role plays.
Sure. So, what I ask people to do who are responsible for interviewing is to try to create an ungameable scenario. These things, I typically leave about 15 to 20 minutes for them. And again, it starts with something that is symptomatic. So similar to the doctor analogy, having a fever, login is a really good one, just because it can play out in so many different ways. And the reason it's ungameable is because if the interviewer has deep knowledge of the problem space, you can just change the variables in your head as you move along through the problem solving exercise. So if they're moving it in one direction, you can change it and morph it into something else so that the scenario continues. To be fair, I do prompt people explicitly, and I tell them, look, we're not going to reach the end of this, just so you know. It might get stranger and stranger as time goes on, but all of these are real scenarios, and they're all based in reality, things that either I've experienced directly before or my team has. And it's really about the journey. It's about I want to know what your thought process is, the kinds of questions you ask. We really want to see the thought process there. And so we'll ask a lot of like, why did you decide to do that? What kind of questions you want? What are you thinking right
Mhm.
now? What, if you could wave a magic wand of like, get me the data, what would you ask for? There's
Mhm.
all these kinds of questions throughout the scenario that just shows you where their mind is going and what kinds of things that they're thinking and if they're going to interact with their team. So I'll do like role plays where I tell them I can be anything you need me to be. I can be your teammate. I can be a backend engineer. I'll definitely be the player. And so you also get to see if they leverage their teammates, um, if they ask questions or not, or if they're just assuming and kind of plowing forward or running into a brick wall. And I've seen people do this. They're stuck in a loop and they never
Mm.
think that they could change something, even though I send them back. I keep sending the player back to them. And so
Right.
you can see like what happens. Like the player has to come back in some scenarios 3, 4 days in a row. And if it gets to that point, I usually just kind of stop the exercise. And I'm like,
Right,
well,
right. You've lost.
yeah, you've lost this one.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So some of the things we talked about that you're looking for in this role play is, does the candidate understand some of those complexities, or are they just kind of assuming this is a straight line, simple question? Are they asking right questions? Are they thinking about the player? So are they keeping the player front and center? And also that technical affinity question. Are they asking questions that indicate they have some understanding of what's going on behind the scenes?
Right. And even if they don't, which can be okay, they know a little bit, at least they know that they don't know and they ask,
Yeah,
the right questions of the pretend
yeah,
technical
yeah.
engineer that I role play. Yeah.
Yeah. Does it have to be someone with deep knowledge of the support team? So can any recruiter from the company's HR team do this? Or does it have to be someone with that super deep knowledge of support?
I would, if I were a recruiter, and this is just how I work with my recruiters across multiple companies. I actually, if I'm ever building teams, I spend a lot of time with my recruiters because to be fair to them, they have so many different disciplines that they need to hire for. But I invest a ton of time with them up front to both understand the role, how to screen, and then after a certain amount of time, teach them how to do these scenarios as well. And so I think for me, or when I hire recruiters, part of their job is actually to get to know the nature of the work. And they would learn, like if I was hiring recruiters, they would actually know how to do this
Right.
kind of an exercise. Yeah.
Got it. So there's other interview questions that you've talked about. Let's talk through some of those. We promised in our marketing for the webinar 5 interview questions that you might not necessarily think about. So let's talk about these. So tell me
Sure.
about a challenge you've overcome. That's something that a lot of companies use, a lot of recruiters use.
Right.
Why is that important for gaming, for player support?
Well, it's fairly standard, and this goes to answer that question about resilience, but it's not, I would say this is contextual. So the interviewer should really know the CV slash resume of the applicant well enough before they go into the interview to ask this question in context. So not just tell me about a challenge you've overcome, it's hey, let's have a conversation. I'm really interested in why you chose to study IT in university. And then as you're having that conversation, you can say, what are some of the biggest challenges you had as a student? So I would contextualize this question in the personal history of the applicant. If there's a particular job that you think is interesting that they've had in the past, being able to ask this question in that context. So it's not without context. It's for this, tell me about this job, get them to open up and share about the actual job. So they're in that state of mind, and then ask this kind of a question and really dig deep. Like it's not just this question, it's the follow-up questions too. Like what specifically did you do? Why was it hard for you? There are technical bits and then there are emotional bits. So I've had conversations with people where sometimes there's an overlap into a personal struggle that they had at that point in their life. And so when you're looking at resilience, it's like, well, people's roughest moments, they're able to share about why it was so hard. And if they can't, it's a red flag for me because it's like, well, you didn't really process why it was hard for you. Um, which means it can mean many things, but it certainly means that I'm curious if you even know how you made it out of that, right? Or if you'd be
Yeah,
able to go through something like that again. And so it's important for me to understand how people have processed their pain and their challenges in the context of what they've shared professionally, right?
yeah.
Certain jobs, certain education experiences, etc.
Mhm. This is an
That does
interesting one.
Yeah, yeah. That this does have into motivation. So personal motivations. I think it's not just about like, well, why do you want this job or why do you want to work at this company? It's like, no, no, no. You know, uh, I want to know what drives you, period. Like when you wake up in the morning, no matter how difficult it is, the day in front of you, like what's going to get you through that day. Um, One of my favorite answers that I see very quickly from honest parents is their children. Um, and they can really talk about their desire to take care of their children and to provide a good future. Some people have very detailed personal philosophies about life, which, if someone does have that, is always interesting to listen to. Um, Whether I agree or not, it's always fascinating to see, what reasons they have. And you're looking for some depth here, right?
Yeah,
It's not just about, oh, why do you want this job?
yeah. Pretend I'm a new employee and I'm looking up to you. What advice would you give?
Yeah, so I like this one because it puts them, in the state of a mentor and for them to be able to present some of their ideas in the best light possible. Um, and so it's hard for a lot of people, actually, if they haven't really processed much. If you're a young person who's been sort of on autopilot for your whole life and kind of going through the motions and 4 years this and 4 years that, something like this can really trip you up. And there's a lot of people who I would say unfortunately get caught up in the momentum of their life
Yeah.
instead of thinking about, you know, what taking, let's say, a greater sense of ownership out of what they're experiencing and what they're going to do next, right? And so
Yeah.
asking somebody for advice shows you what's important to them, and the depth of the advice, right? Like, is it good advice? Does it sound like bad
Right.
advice? It can be very interesting. I'm like, oh, really? You'd recommend
Right.
that?
I don't want
Okay.
you telling that to my new employee.
Yeah, yeah. I'm like,
Right, right, right. And then a couple good ones for technical affinity. Do you know how your internet works? I like that.
yeah, yeah. It's kind of like fun, but yeah. So I mean, just poking at folks to talk a little bit about technology, what interests them, and sometimes people will directly mention things in their resume, and so poke at that very specifically. Like I remember interviewing somebody who was IT help desk. And so it was very easy to kind of ask her about, hey, like what's some of the harder technical issues you've resolved? And she was very honest. She's like, well, the hardest one is one that I couldn't resolve. And I was like,
Right.
whoa. And she just shared that up front and
Yeah.
it was this crazy like hacker thing. And I was like, well, it's not, your fault necessarily. They break the machine, held it for ransom, but super interesting stories, right?
Right,
But then you get to, I mean, she was very technically competent, but it
right,
was a
right,
really
right.
interesting story. But yeah, all that kind of stuff, troubleshooting and
Yeah.
basic troubleshooting, stuff like that. If they just like seem really nervous and they're like, no, I don't know anything, it's like kind of like, oh,
Right,
you
right.
might not want to fail them just based off of that, but you do want to make a note of that, right? They might
Yeah,
need additional training module or something to start.
yeah. So we've talked about a lot here. What if you're in a situation where you've got to hire 200 people in a week? We've been in that situation at peak support. When you're in that, I think you called it blitz scale, in that
Yeah.
really fast scale situation. What if you got to boil this down to 15 minutes?
Yes. So there's a couple of things that we do in blitz scale situations. Ah, I wouldn't I wouldn't necessarily boil it down to 15 minutes. It depends what your funnel looks like. Like if you have multiple interviews, you might do one less, as an
Right.
example. It's super duper hard. 15 minutes is such a short time. I would really focus the conversation. I would apologize to them because maybe there wouldn't be enough time for their question asking. What would I do? All right, if the criteria is 15 minutes, wow, that's not enough time. It's just not enough time. But um, I would focus on uh the I probably just do something along the lines of critical thinking, whether that's the scenario itself or talking to someone about their specific experience in a particular role and how they went through that. Just because you're able to get to cover a number of those types of criteria that are important to you in the form of a story, right?
Yeah.
Narrative is much stronger and uh, a stronger and more natural way of getting to know somebody's story or a fraction of it.
Yeah. Got it. And you referenced Q&A as well, leaving time for Q&A. Tough if you've only got 15 minutes, but in a typical interview, ideally giving the candidate time to ask questions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You need to like in normal times, I would give a meaningful chunk of time to the candidate to ask questions, and there's a lot you can tell about um, about the candidate based on the quality of questions that they're asking you. If it's just the standard stuff, you're like, okay, fine. Um, but a lot of times when you get very solid, deeper, interesting questions, that could really tip the scales in a positive way, at least for me. If I get very interesting, deep questions, that shows me that, this person's just more thoughtful than the average candidate, and that's
Yeah.
a good sign.
And if you get no questions, that's a sign as well.
That's
Maybe a little
scary.
bit of a,
Yes, that's very
yeah.
scary. Maybe they're just shotgun applying, and you're just wanting
Right,
to
right, right.
spray and pray,
Note to
as we like to say
candidates,
in gaming.
always
Yeah,
ask questions.
please
Um,
do. Yeah.
all right, so you've got this awesome team. We'll talk a little bit. You have some really interesting frameworks for culture and for management. So let's talk about your framework for culture. What are the components of that? So four components that we talked about: stories, systems, values, and then individual leadership behaviors. Talk about what these are.
Yes, sure. So, yeah, I mean, stories are the stories that your employees tell. They tell each other. They tell their family members, they tell their friends, they share around the water cooler. It's the things that you're never going to see on your employee surveys, most likely, because a lot of people are adverse to affecting anyone's livelihood through, negative sounding feedback on official surveys, or they're worried about anonymity or something like that. And so these are the stories that people just share, and these you find a lot of truth in these. Important to know. That's the reality of your culture, right? I talk a lot about memes, for example, is like one of the ways it's like very information dense storytelling, mixed with humor. And like a really good meme is great feedback for executives and management to understand some of the challenges of the environment that you have. Systems are all of the things that curb human behavior in your environment. So your how you evaluate performance, your surveys, any of your official mechanisms, the fact that you have, a certain kind of QA form. So QA forms themselves, QA teams themselves, the disposition of those teams, anything where anyone is being evaluated or graded on anything officially, all of those will affect, even the way that kind of you give rewards or punishments, um, everything that you have that curbs human behavior. Values, these are the things that values are really tricky. There are what I call real values, which again is tied up with the stories. So, what are people actually doing, and what behaviors are actually being rewarded, and which ones are being punished? And then
So
there
not
are
necessarily the
maybe,
values on the wall, or
yeah.
the actual values. What does the
Yeah.
leadership actually value and reward?
Exactly. And what are your systems telling your people about what you actually value? And then, there are the stated values that you alluded to, the things that are on the wall. And the bigger the dissonance is between those two things, just the harder and harder it's going to grade against your employees. And so values are really tricky. I'm very, very biased towards paying attention to what is real slash perceived, not what is maybe aspirational or ideal, because I'd rather just deal with the reality and talk about that. And that isn't dictated by sitting down, as tough as the exercise might be to come up with a set of values and put them in posters and on the wall. But it's really something that emerges out of the reality of your environment. Um, Individual leadership behaviors all tied up within that, right?
Yeah.
How are your leaders actually behaving? What do they do? There's so many people out there where their reality is pleasing their boss. It doesn't matter what they're supposed to be doing or what systems you have in place or what the values on the wall say. They know that they're going to get what they need in their life and professional progression by pleasing their boss. And so it has a lot to do with what's going on in your company.
Yeah. I remember that was advice I once gave to a new employee at a place where I worked was um, your client is your boss. It doesn't actually matter how your client feels. What matters is how your boss feels about you and what
Mhm.
stories they're telling the rest of the management about it. If your boss thinks you did a great job, you're good. So
Yeah,
you got to make
exactly.
sure that the boss is judging based on criterias that actually make sense and for the organization.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, they have to really understand what the client's valuing here and
Yeah.
be able to align to it.
Yeah.
Because if
And
you
make sure
don't,
your
you'll just be at
systems are
odds.
aligned as
Yep,
well. Your
all of
reward
that.
systems. Yeah.
Yep, all of that.
All right, so let's talk about your management framework. And I love this because it's just super straightforward tools that you need to manage your team. And I actually realized when we talked about this initially that this is a great tool for me and for my team. I have several team members who've been with us a long time, and we have no job description. The job has changed dramatically.
Right,
Um,
right.
so talk about your management framework, job description, core competencies, relationships, achievements, and parking lot.
Cool. Yeah. So this is something I'm super passionate about. I built it up over the course of my career. It's based off of Dungeons and Dragons tabletop game. But essentially, the character creation for those anyone who plays D&D. Um, but cool. We should play a game sometime. But the job description, our jobs are always changing, especially in this line of work, and so it's nice to have a touch point to actually talk about. Well, what's the core responsibilities that you have in your job, and just to make sure that the changes that have occurred are understood by both parties. It's not just I have all these additional responsibilities that I'm not being recognized or rewarded for. That could really hurt, the relationship between an employee and the company and their manager because they're taking on all this additional stuff and yeah, they feel like it's thankless, right? And maybe the manager's unaware. I didn't know who asked you to do that, and maybe actually you want to take it off their plate. And so there's all these
Right.
conversations that don't happen, and all these assumptions that are made if you don't at least touch base and say, "Hey, is this still correct? Do we need to add anything? Do we need to take anything away? Right? Do we need to make sure you're not overburdened?" So job description's there. It's like a class description in D&D. You're going to be a rogue. You're going to be a warrior, a mage, something like that. Number two, core competencies is so if you're, what are the basic set of skills for your class that you want to be? So if you're a mage, obviously you need to be able to cast spells, etc. But so you're for your job, what are the skills you need to be successful? And what level do you possess those at? And usually we start with a very simple general self-assessment, and we kind of build on from there. And so it's really like a skill tree for those of you who have played the game before or have played RPG games before. And so we're looking at, hey, if the manager functions kind of like a DM, like if you want to be this kind of a character, you actually these three skills are non-negotiable. You actually need those, right? If you want to be a manager, you have to know how to do performance management. You have to know how to organize schedules appropriately, whatever it is, these are the must-haves. And then there are other variations that are optional that, you can mix into your own style, but there are things that are core to your job. And so how are you in these things? And it can be used in multiple ways, both as a way to understand your own development and what we need to work on together for your own, continuing education, but then also, if we have, any kind of performance issues, or maybe somebody is not rated as highly as they want to be rated, this could also help expose, like, oh, like you actually don't know how to do this, and that's what prevents you from, putting out a higher quality output for, these kinds of tasks. So let's shore that up, right? So you can have very targeted conversations around individual development, relationships. Um, this is really important. So everyone has their own personal disposition. I don't believe most people, you are who you are, and that's great. And if we want to, you know, um, take care of everybody who's in the workplace, we have to take those kind of personality dispositions into account. And it's not just about that in and of itself, but like how does that affect the way that you relate to other people on the team, or people that you have work dependencies with. And so we talk about relationships, is there any notable interactions you had, positive or negative, throughout the week that we want to talk about? And it actually helps the manager as well to understand, okay, there might be friction here. Is there anything I can do to relieve that? There's a misunderstanding, and to try to get to things proactively instead of letting them fester,
Yeah.
which can create really kind of touchy, difficult problems to sort through over
I
the
like
long
this one
term.
because I think a lot of times this is phrased as cultural fit, which I
Mhm.
think is hard to sort of think about. And sometimes it ends up sort of being like, you just don't fit in here. I
Yeah,
like this because it's actually getting at um what's actually important to your job, which is how are your relationships with the other people around you, and are they such that you're able to get your job done?
correct, correct. And achievements, a lot of these would be kind of like the feats you select in D&D, but essentially and there's usually a story behind the feats. And so these are the big accomplishments that you have had throughout, the quarter, the year. A lot of times I found that the people that I manage were not, whenever they would fill out like a CV or talk about their job, it would look just like a job description. I'm like, no, 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 no. Like, what's the story of your work? Like, what did you actually achieve? And so
Hmm.
when I've mentored folks, even outside of my department, and we go through this, they do it for the first time. They're really surprised. They're like, oh, I had a lot of achievements this year. I'm like, yeah, this is a great place to build up a mutual understanding of what are the real achievements, not imagined, the real ones with actual evidence. And
Yeah.
what this is, it's a really good way to keep an accurate record of the evidence that slowly builds up the business case for, a significant raise or promotion. And a lot of times I feel like many employees, especially in the customer service space, they're very like sweet people. And so they're not good at advocating for themselves. And so this helps them because, the manager, you have this ongoing record, and then you're able to put together a strong business case and to teach them how to advocate for themselves in the workplace. To say, hey, I've reached this level of achievement, I delivered this much value. Like, can I have a reward for it? And not to feel shy about that. And for us as a company to be like, yes, absolutely, There's a whole mountain of evidence for each one of these things. This is really fantastic. Parking lot is I usually put a sign or the GIF up that says there is no Fight Club. Basically, it's a parking lot to say, hey, if you can develop a relationship of trust with your people, sometimes they'll feel comfortable telling you things outside of work that are affecting work. Let's just be realistic here. Sometimes terrible things happen in people's lives and they need help. And this has been an opportunity for me to let certain employees know that they had mental health benefits that they never even knew existed. I'm like, hey, did you, I don't, you know, I know this is really sensitive, but you share these things with me, and I want you to know that we have these benefits, and you can go to HR and you can take advantage of these things. They're like, we have that, and I'm like, yeah, you had this for all the years you've been here. You didn't know it, and they're like,
Right,
oh.
right,
And
right.
so
Yeah.
it's a great way to share the benefits of how the company actually cares for its employees.
Yeah. All right. So we have a few minutes left. I do want to make sure we leave a few minutes for Q&A at the end. Um, so just a couple more things to talk about. Let's talk about how you get buy-in from your tech team. So you talked about that scenario early on where you're looking for something to get done for support and a year later it's still not done. How do you make sure that doesn't happen? And then I want to talk a little bit about AI and how you see that shaping player support today.
Cool. So I'll be really quick on this. Essentially, it is learn the language of your development team, how they size work, how they use Jira, etc. Build a relationship with the producer or the PM or whoever's in charge of the backlog. Make sure you build a relationship of trust. Learn how they talk about their work, how they size it, how they write user stories, what their internal lingo is, and what things, how to present information in a way that is very quickly understandable by them, and how to size work so they know, which ones are bigger, which ones are smaller. So they
And you
might
were
be
a
able
game
to,
developer, so that
yes,
makes
yes, yes.
you knew the language going in. But for
Yeah, yeah.
folks who weren't,
Right.
Sort of
Yeah, yeah,
step in the shoes of the game developer.
correct. And I started in production, so that was one advantage that I had. But I would encourage all support folks to do that. If you have a dev team responsible for something, learn their lingo, learn how to communicate with them, and gain their trust so you can be a trusted partner in prioritization of the backlog.
And second, bring
Um,
the data.
yeah, bring the data. So yeah, make sure that whenever you're advocating for something that you've got very strong data. A lot of producers tell me, they're very pleasantly surprised when I bring them user stories or something like that because they're like, oh, you're telling me what the value of this is, like the dollar value. So we calculate like size of problems in cost. Sometimes that's easily done. What's the ongoing support cost of this on a monthly basis? And they're like, okay, cool. That's $1 million a month problem. Yeah, I'm going to solve that right
Right.
now, And so it just makes it easier. Some cases I don't
Yeah.
even have to advocate for it.
Yeah. Just showing that there's ROI there. And finally, break it
Absolutely.
up.
Yeah, sometimes so you want to, sometimes things are too big. And if you don't know how to do this, you might make it so big that it never really gets picked up. But if you can break them down into the smallest pieces possible, one of my teams once asked me, really wonderful devs, he said, "Hey Tony, if you could break this up as small as possible, what we can do is a lot of the devs might finish their sprint a little bit early, and they're like, hey, I want to do something for support, but everything's like chunked out too big. So if you have stuff that you can break down to its smallest components, you can actually move things along a little bit faster. It might get done in like small bite-sized pieces, but so long as it gets done, right? You might actually have something delivered instead of waiting a whole year for it. You might have it delivered in, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, something like that.
Yeah. And one of the anecdotes you shared just around this topic of earn trust is that you got to the point where you could essentially put your own cards in Jira, sort of not exactly assign tasks to the developers, but you sort of got enough buy-in where you could kind of submit something, hey, this is a task that needed to be done, as opposed to going through pre-approval for it. So that's one of the benefits if you can earn that trust over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you can, a lot of devs are super duper cool. And if you have that trust, they're like, yeah, dude, just throw new cards in the back. And then we have, in many cases, a weekly meeting or a monthly meeting where we talk about prioritization. And they're like, okay, when, when can we get stuff in? And I get at least, some kind of, for stuff that's very far away, a verbal commitment to revisit in a certain month or whatever. But you're keeping that friendly pressure on, not for yourself, it's for the players, right? So,
Yeah.
but at least you're keeping that pressure up so they know it needs to get done.
So let's talk a little bit about AI. What are you seeing? What are your clients seeing and doing? What are some hazards that people need to be aware of?
Well, I mean, new technologies, there's always going to be, glitches along the way, so to speak. Um, I would say we've seen quite a bit in terms of not um, narrowing things or not kind of putting in fences so that the your AI doesn't go wild and or go rogue, so to speak, has happened a few times already. But what I would say is a couple things that we see um, if you're using it for recruiting or if you're using it across your simple ticket functions, it's always important to make sure that you've got really good people who are reviewing what is done. Sometimes I think we could take the automation for granted, even when it wasn't AI, we take automations for granted. Make sure that you're constantly checking for accuracy of things. A lot of these models you still sort of teach and they learn alongside human beings, making sure that this is a constant thing that you're looking out for. And I would say not neglecting the value of the human being in the mix.
Yeah.
Um, if these are truly augmentations that up productivity by orders of magnitude, you still need a human being to be able to, perform audits or checks, um, or to make sure that the quality of what's being output is actually something you would be happy with.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, there's a lot that could be
Yeah.
missed, and so yeah.
Absolutely. A lot more to talk about, obviously, on that topic, but I do want to leave a couple minutes for Q&A. So first of all, this is how you can reach us, and we will send this information in a follow-up as well to everyone here. Follow Tony on LinkedIn, follow me on LinkedIn. Both of us left our cell phone numbers here as well as our emails. So also, if you have a follow-up question, please feel free to reach out, and we'll try to get to those after the webinar. But we do have 3 minutes left. If there's any other questions for Tony, I will stop sharing my screen so I can take a look and see if there are any questions in the chat. Yeah, I have a question here. What is your advice when it comes to incorporating AI in an established team? What's a good way to find balance between making sure that they don't become overly relying on it, but making sure they maximize the benefits of it?
We're, I would say you have to have some kind of uh, at least directional goal for the use of AI before you begin integrating it. If it's primarily for, efficiency increases, you have to be very specific about what that means. Because to your point, like if people just take it for granted that this is good information or good output or that it's going to be okay, then you could end up making some really big mistakes. We've seen law firms make this mistake, right, where they use the chat GPT or whatever, and it just gives like it's factually wrong,
Right.
and you look really, really foolish, right? And so
Yeah.
you have to be really crystal clear about the goals. And I would try to take it in small bites so that people, really understand what they're using it for and that it's achieving the actual stated goal. So it's like
Yeah.
efficiency, but that has to be balanced with accuracy, um, as one example, right?
Yeah.
And I would do it in those small bite-sized chunks.
We got one more
And
question,
oh, sure.
similar along this topic. How does the future player support hiring profile look with the rise of AI in this industry? And I'll also say, I think one answer to this is I think that critical thinking piece is, if anything, even more important. All of those human traits, the critical thinking, the resilience, the ability to navigate emotional conversations, becomes more important, especially as we're looking to the situation where humans aren't necessarily dealing with the simplest tickets. They're dealing with the thorny ones.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you want the the near term use case, strongest use case for AI is to do those very repetitive things, and to, yeah, it can deal with increasingly complex things, but I think if you're looking for the human touch, uh, basically being the best human being you can be, the best conversationalist you can be, um, it's gonna like even for generative AI for large language models today, right? Like it can generate you like a bunch of generalities that sound right, but it's not going to be able to provide like the best case lawyers, for example, are not going to be replaced by ChatGPT anytime soon because it's not going to be able to have a that edge or that particular perspective that wins a court case. It might be able to tell you about previous court cases and what precedents
Right.
are and what not and regurgitate stuff for you very nicely, but it's not going to be able to, at least not yet, replace those very human, emotionally driven decisions
Yeah.
that we need. And if you want a good conversational, partner for these sorts of things, you really do need somebody who's going to be able to make sure that these functions are going well, right? And so, yeah, you'll need less. That's just the reality of things.
Yeah.
But if you can human being extremely well, then you will be the one to sort of watch over the bot, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Tony. It is absolutely fantastic to have you here today. Thank you very much. For everyone here, you can find us on LinkedIn. You can email us, reach out by cell phone. We'll send you all of this information in an email after the webinar. We look forward to talking with you more. Thank you so much for being here.